Hey guys, tonight we're talking about one of the most insane military operations in human history. A march so deadly that half an army died just getting to the battlefield. Hannibal Barca decided to walk 50,000 men and 37 war elephants over the Alps in autumn. Not around them, over them. Through mountain passes where the air gets so thin men collapse, where temperatures drop so low fingers snap off like icicles, where one wrong step means 1,000-foot fall onto rocks. The Romans thought the Alps were a natural wall, an impenetrable barrier that made northern Italy safe. Hannibal turned their greatest defence into a highway straight to their heartland. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. You're 23 years old. You've never seen Rome, but you've been trained since childhood to hate it with every breath. You've never questioned why Carthage and Rome must destroy each other. You know this truth the way you know the Mediterranean turns dark blue before storms. The priest sacrificed a bull this morning, and the omens were mixed. Blood flowed wrong, but the liver showed strength. Your leather armour sits heavy on your shoulders, boiled and hardened over weeks until it could turn a blade. The spear in your hand was forged by your uncle, bronze tip hammered and sharpened until it could punch through Roman shields. Everyone says this march will make history or kill you. Probably both. The smell hit first that spring morning in New Carthage. Not normal sweat or leather or sea salt. 50,000 men packed into a city built for 20,000 created a stench of unwashed bodies, cooking fires, animal dung from 9,000 horses, and something else, fear masked as aggression. The war elephants trumpeted from their pens near the harbour, the sound rolling across the city like thunder before rain. 37 of the massive beasts, each capable of crushing a man beneath one foot, each worth more than a year's pay for an entire company. The docks groaned under crates of weapons, grain sacks stacked in pyramids, amphorae of oil and wine numbered in the thousands. Hannibal Barca stood on the steps of the Temple of Melkart, watching his army prepare. 29 years old, commander of Carthage's forces in Iberia, son of Hamilcar Barca who'd nearly broken Rome in the last war. His father had made him swear an oath at age 9, eternal enmity to Rome, a promise spoken over sacrificial flames that still burned in his mind. The hatred wasn't abstract. Rome had humiliated Carthage, stripped away Sicily and Sardinia, imposed crushing tribute payments that bled the city white. His father had spent years rebuilding Carthaginian power in Spain, conquering tribes, mining silver, raising armies. Then he died, and Hannibal inherited everything: the armies, the silver mines, the burning desire for revenge. The plan sounded like madness when he first proposed it to his officers. March from Spain to Italy overland, cross the Pyrenees, fight through Gaul, then take the army over the Alps before winter, attack Rome from the north where their defences were weakest, where they'd never expect an invasion, turn Rome's allies against them, burn their farms, strangle their economy until the Republic collapsed. His officers had stared in silence. No army had crossed the Alps with elephants. The mountains killed even small, experienced groups regularly. Leading 50,000 men through those peaks in autumn meant losing thousands to cold, starvation, and falls. Hannibal had been planning this for 3 years. His scouts had mapped every major pass, catalogued which Gallic tribes might be friendly, which would demand payment, which would fight. He'd sent agents ahead with gold, making alliances, securing supplies, establishing depots. The Romans expected him to invade by sea. They'd stationed fleets to intercept any Carthaginian ships heading for Italy. They'd fortified the coastal approaches. Their entire strategic calculation assumed water routes. Walking an army over the highest mountains in Europe? Impossible. Which meant they'd never see it coming. The army that assembled that spring morning represented a dozen different peoples. The core infantry came from Libya, heavy spearmen with large shields, disciplined and loyal, trained in the same formations Romans used. Spanish warriors brought lighter equipment but ferocious fighting spirit, experienced in mountain warfare from constant tribal conflicts. Numidian cavalry rode horses so well they seemed part of the animal. Light horsemen who could shower enemies with javelins then vanish before counterattack. Balearic slingers could kill at 100 paces with lead bullets that cracked skulls. Celtic mercenaries from Gaul stood head and shoulders above everyone else, massive men with long swords and lime-washed hair. Carthaginian officers commanded this polyglot force, speaking 6 languages, managing ethnic tensions, somehow forging a functional fighting machine from chaotic human diversity. The elephants posed unique problems. 37 African forest elephants, smaller than the Indian variety but still enormous, each requiring 100 pounds of food daily. Specially trained handlers from families who'd worked with elephants for generations managed the beasts with a mix of patience and violence. The elephant served multiple purposes: shock troops that could break infantry formations, mobile platforms for archers, and psychological weapons that terrified enemies who'd never seen them. But they were also immensely fragile. They panicked easily. They couldn't survive cold. They needed specialized food. Taking them across the Alps was strategic brilliance or suicidal stupidity, depending on whether it worked. The march began in May. Hannibal left garrisons to hold Spain, peeled off troops for this duty, and started north with roughly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and all 37 elephants. The numbers tell part of the story. He expected massive losses and planned for them. The first obstacle came quickly. The Pyrenees rose like a jagged wall between Spain and Gaul. Local Iberian tribes controlled the passes and had no love for Carthaginians. They attacked the column as it stretched thin through mountain defiles, rolling rocks down on packed soldiers, ambushing supply trains, then melting into the hills. Hannibal responded with calculated brutality. His light infantry hunted the raiders through the mountains, his cavalry cut off escape routes, and when he finally cornered the main tribal force, he offered terms: submit or die. Most submitted. Those who didn't were slaughtered. Their settlements burned as examples. The Pyrenees crossing cost him 3 weeks and roughly 10,000 men, casualties he'd anticipated. More importantly, it hardened the army. The soldiers who emerged from those mountains had killed, had seen friends die, had learned to trust the man next to them regardless of what language he spoke. Gaul spread before them like a patchwork quilt of tribal territories. Some tribes welcomed Carthaginian gold and promises of Roman loot. Others demanded payment to cross their lands. A few prepared for war. Hannibal navigated this political maze with a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and overwhelming force. He couldn't afford prolonged sieges. Every day mattered with winter approaching. When tribes proved friendly, he paid generously and moved on. When they proved hostile, he crushed them so thoroughly that neighbouring tribes surrendered without fighting. The army ate through supplies at a terrifying rate. 90,000 men required hundreds of tons of grain daily. The horses and elephants needed even more. Hannibal's logistics officers performed near miracles, coordinating supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles back to Spain, purchasing food from Gallic tribes, rationing carefully to stretch provisions. Still, They marched perpetually on the edge of starvation. One bad harvest in Gaul, one broken supply line, one unexpected battle, and the entire army could collapse. Word of the approaching army spread faster than the army itself. Traders carried stories of the elephants. Refugees fled before the Carthaginian advance, spreading exaggerated tales. By midsummer, all of Gaul knew Hannibal was coming. More significantly, Rome knew. They dispatched Publius Cornelius Scipio with an army to intercept him, confident they could crush the Carthaginians before they reached Italy. The race was on. Hannibal needed to cross the Rhone River and reach the Alps before the Romans caught him in the open plains where their heavy infantry excelled. The army reached the Rhone in late August. The river flowed wide and fast, swollen with mountain snowmelt, a natural barrier that had stopped armies before. On the far bank, the Volki tribe had assembled thousands of warriors. They'd heard about the elephants and weren't impressed. They planned to drown the Carthaginians in the river and claim the glory of stopping Hannibal. Scouts reported Roman forces 3 days south marching fast. Hannibal faced converging enemies with a major river crossing ahead and time running out. The Alps waited beyond, their peaks already showing the first dustings of snow. Everything depended on the next 48 hours. The Rhone moved like a living thing, brown water churning with debris from upstream storms. Trees thick as a man's torso tumbled past in the current. The river stretched nearly half a mile wide at this point, far too deep to ford, moving too fast for inexperienced swimmers to survive. Volcae warriors lined the opposite bank in their thousands, shields painted with spiral patterns, spears glinting in morning sun. They beat their weapons against their shields, creating a thunderous rhythm that echoed across the water, a challenge and a promise of slaughter. Hannibal ordered his engineers to begin construction immediately. They fanned out along the riverbank, commandeering every boat, raft and canoe from local settlements for miles in both directions. Soldiers felled trees with frantic energy, lashing logs together with rope and leather strips to create crude rafts. The Gauls who'd allied with Hannibal contributed their own vessels and river knowledge. Within a day, hundreds of watercraft clustered along the near shore, ranging from solid river barges to barely functional log platforms that looked ready to sink. The elephants presented an entirely different nightmare. The handlers tried leading one bull into the shallows to test his reaction. The animal took 3 steps, felt the current pulling at his legs, and retreated so violently he nearly trampled his own handler. African forest elephants, despite their size, feared water they couldn't see the bottom of, an instinct that kept them alive in rivers full of crocodiles back home. That same instinct now threatened the entire operation. Hannibal summoned his best engineers for an emergency solution. They proposed building massive rafts, floating platforms strong enough to support an elephant's weight, disguised to look like solid ground. The construction required 2 more days. Soldiers cut trees constantly, the sound of axes ringing through the valley. They layered logs until the platforms measured 30 feet across, covered them with dirt and sod, then attached them to larger rafts in pairs. The elephants would walk onto what appeared to be an extension of the riverbank. Handlers would cut the connecting ropes, and the current would carry the platform across. In theory. Meanwhile, Hanno took 1,000 picked cavalry and 5,000 light infantry north along the river. They travelled fast, carrying minimal supplies, moving through the night. Their mission was simple but critical. Find a crossing point upstream, get across, then circle behind the Volki position. Hannibal needed the enemy distracted and divided when the main crossing began. Hanno's force disappeared into the darkness, and Hannibal had no way to communicate with them once they left. Everything depended on timing and trust. The third night, Hannibal assembled his officers. He'd received reports from scouts that the Roman army under Scipio had reached a Gallic town 3 days south. They were asking questions, offering gold for information, and marching north at forced speed. The window for crossing was collapsing. If the Romans arrived while half his army was on each side of the river, they'd annihilate him. The Volcae alone weren't the real threat. The Romans were. Dawn broke on the 4th day with smoke signals rising from the hills across the river. Hanno had crossed upstream and was in position. Hannibal gave the order immediately. Soldiers pushed the boats and rafts into the water, paddling frantically against the current. The lighter cavalry horses were driven into the river to swim alongside boats, riders clinging to manes. The first wave consisted of Spanish and Gallic troops, expendable forces who'd bear the brunt of Volcae resistance. The enemy reaction was instantaneous and violent. As the first boats reached midstream, Volcae warriors rushed into the shallows, hurling javelins and stones. The projectiles fell like deadly rain. Men toppled from boats, dragged under by armour and current. Some rafts overturned entirely, spilling soldiers into water that swallowed them. The river turned red in patches. Screams mixed with the roar of water and the thunder of shields being beaten. Then the second wave launched. Heavy Libyan infantry in more solid boats, equipped with shields large enough to protect against missiles. They formed a floating barrier, absorbing the Volca barrage while lighter troops paddled past them toward landing points downstream. Hannibal had studied the current patterns and chosen spots where the river would help carry boats to shore. The Carthaginian crossing became a chaotic storm of movement. Thousands of men in hundreds of vessels spread across half a mile of churning water. The Volcae began running along their bank, following the drifting boats, concentrating their warriors where they expected landings. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted. He needed them focused on the river, committed to the waterline packed into killing zones. The first Carthaginian soldiers hit the far shore, and immediately formed shield walls creating tiny beachheads. Volcae warriors swarmed these positions, fighting hand to hand in ankle-deep water. Smoke rose from behind the Volcae position. Hanno's cavalry appeared on the heights, sun glinting off spear tips. The timing was flawless. The Volcae warriors saw the threat simultaneously. Enemy soldiers were behind them, between them and their homes, their families, their supplies. Panic rippled through their formation faster than any order could travel. Their leaders screamed commands, trying to organize defense against two threats. But tribal armies weren't built for complex maneuvers. Hannibal immediately pushed his third wave, the main body of cavalry and heavy infantry. With the Volcae distracted and disorganized, boats made the crossing with minimal losses. The warriors on the far bank broke. Some turned to face Hanno's force, some tried to hold the riverbank, most simply ran. The Carthaginian beachheads expanded rapidly, merging into a continuous position. Within 2 hours of the first boat launching, Hannibal controlled enough of the far bank to begin landing supplies. The elephants remained. Their handlers had been giving them wine mixed with water for hours, trying to calm their nerves. The first platform was pushed into the current with 2 female elephants standing on it, eating from piles of hay that handlers had strategically placed. The animals munched contentedly as the platform drifted, not realizing they were moving. One elephant looked up, saw water all around, and trumpeted in panic. She tried to turn, and the platform tilted. Both elephants slid into the river. The handlers dove in after them. Elephants can swim, but they panic easily, and a panicked elephant drowns itself thrashing. The handlers grabbed ears and trunks, guiding the animals' heads upstream into the current, swimming alongside and shouting encouragement. Both elephants made it across, exhausted and terrified, but alive. The lesson was clear. The platform method was too unpredictable. Hannibal ordered a new approach. The largest, calmest bull elephant was led onto a platform with his favourite female. As the platform began drifting, handlers used long poles to keep it stable. More importantly, they kept the bull calm by keeping the female calm. The crossing took 30 terrifying minutes. The elephant shifted weight constantly, making the platform list and dip. Halfway across, he realised what was happening and began trumpeting, but the handlers kept him focused on the female ahead. Both reached the far bank safely. The remaining elephants crossed over the next 6 hours, most on platforms, a few swimming when they panicked and fell in. 3 platforms capsized completely. 2 elephants drowned, their massive bodies pulled under by the current and never recovered. Another swam to the wrong bank and wandered off into the wilderness, lost forever. The handlers mourned each loss. These animals took years to train and cost fortunes to maintain. But 34 elephants made it across, and that was enough. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. By sunset, the entire army stood on the western bank of the Rhône. Casualties from the crossing numbered around 300 dead, mostly drowned in the first chaotic waves. Another 200 wounded had survived but would slow the march. The Volcae had melted away into the hills, beaten but not destroyed. Hanno's force rejoined the main army, exhausted from 2 days of forced marching and fighting. Supply rafts continued crossing through the night, ferried by soldiers working in shifts. Scipio's scouts arrived at the abandoned Carthaginian camp 2 days later. They found fire pits still warm, equipment too damaged to carry, and tracks from thousands of men and animals heading north. Scipio had missed Hannibal by 48 hours. He'd expected to catch the Carthaginians divided at the river, vulnerable to attack, ripe for slaughter. Instead, he found empty camps and realised his enemy had vanished into the interior of Gaul, heading toward mountains no sane commander would attempt. The Roman general faced a choice: chase Hannibal into the Alps where the terrain favoured ambush and winter was approaching, or return to Italy by sea and prepare defences. His officers debated the question for hours. Chasing Hannibal meant pursuing an enemy through hostile territory with stretched supply lines. But letting him go meant admitting that Carthage had outmanoeuvred Rome. Scipio chose pragmatism over pride. He sent most of his army back to Italy under his brother's command while he returned to Spain to cut off Hannibal's reinforcements and supplies. Hannibal, meanwhile, pushed north along the Rhone's western tributaries, following river valleys toward the mountains. Local tribes reported seeing the Alps clearly from their settlements: white peaks that pierced clouds, permanent snow visible even in summer, passes known for sudden storms and treacherous ice. The soldiers who'd never seen mountains began to understand what they faced. Africans from coastal cities, men who'd spent lives at sea level where water never froze, now marched toward peaks that rose 2 miles into the sky. The temperature dropped perceptibly as they travelled north. September brought colder nights, frost on grass in the mornings, breath steaming in the air. The Numidian cavalry horses, bred in North African heat, shivered even in daylight. Officers began distributing warmer clothing: wool cloaks, leather leggings, felt boots, but they didn't have enough for everyone. The army would enter the Alps partially equipped for the cold, gambling that speed would get them through before the worst weather hit. Gallic guides appeared, offering to lead the army through the passes. Some were genuine, sent by allied tribes. Others were opportunists seeking payment. A few were almost certainly sent by enemies to lead the Carthaginians into traps. Hannibal interrogated them separately, compared their descriptions of routes, and cross-referenced everything against his scouts' earlier reports. He chose the path that appeared most direct while avoiding territories controlled by hostile tribes. The foothills appeared first as gentle rises in the landscape, green and forested, almost welcoming. Then the real mountains emerged from behind them, a wall of rock and ice that dominated the northern horizon. The Alps stretched east and west as far as anyone could see, an apparently impenetrable barrier that had protected northern Italy for centuries. No invading army had ever crossed them with a force this size. The soldiers stared at the peaks and understood, truly understood, that thousands of them would die up there. Hannibal ordered a day of rest before beginning the ascent. Soldiers checked equipment, repaired worn boots, redistributed supplies. The elephants were fed extra rations. They'd need every bit of strength for what came next. Officers gave speeches about glory, about revenge against Rome, about riches waiting in Italy. But mostly, the army prepared in silence, each man dealing with fear in his own way. The march into the Alps began on a clear morning in early October. The path started wide and gentle, following a river valley. By noon, it had narrowed to a track barely wide enough for loaded pack animals. By evening, the mountains rose on both sides like walls, and the army had entered a world where one mistake could kill 1,000 men. The Allobroge watched from the heights above, counting the foreign soldiers as they filed through the gorge below. The tribal warriors had positioned themselves perfectly, on both sides of the narrow pass, behind boulders and rock formations, completely invisible to the column snaking through the valley floor. They'd done this before, ambushing merchant caravans and small military detachments, killing everyone and taking everything. An army this size simply meant more plunder. Their chief had made contact with Hannibal 3 days earlier, offering guides and safe passage through Allobroge territory in exchange for gold. Hannibal had paid generously, and the chief had smiled and promised protection. The guides now led the Carthaginian vanguard deeper into the trap, pointing out the safest paths, urging them to move faster before nightfall. Behind them, 50,000 men and 34 elephants stretched in a column over 4 miles long, completely vulnerable. Hannibal rode near the front but kept watching the heights. Something felt wrong. The guides were too eager, too insistent about speed. The local villagers had abandoned their settlements too thoroughly. No one left behind, no livestock, no stored food. Ambush sites lined this entire gorge, and his instincts screamed danger. He'd survived 20 years of warfare by trusting those instincts. He ordered the heavy infantry and cavalry to continue through the pass, while he personally took light troops up the slopes on both sides. The maneuver confused his guides, who suddenly became very interested in why he was deviating from the path. Hannibal ignored their protests. His Balearic slingers and Spanish light infantry scrambled up the rocky hillsides, moving fast despite the altitude. They spread out, searching for threats. They found the Allobroge positions just before dusk. Hundreds of warriors crouched behind rocks, weapons ready, waiting for the signal to attack. Some positions held massive boulders levered into place, ready to be rolled down onto the column. Others stockpiled spears and stones for the killing to come. The Carthaginians attacked immediately, no warning, no negotiation. Slingers launched lead bullets that cracked skulls and shattered bones. Light infantry charged with javelins, then closed with swords. The Allobroges reacted with shock. They'd been the hunters and suddenly became prey. Some fought back viciously, defending their positions with desperate courage. Others fled into the mountains, abandoning their ambush posts. The fighting spread across the hillsides as Carthaginian troops systematically cleared the heights. Down in the gorge, the main column heard the sounds of battle echoing from above but couldn't see what was happening. Panic rippled through the packed soldiers. Boulders began falling anyway. Some Alabro's positions remained intact long enough to trigger their traps. Massive rocks tumbled down slopes, gathering speed, crashing into the column with devastating force. Men were crushed instantly, their screams cut short. Horses bolted in terror, throwing riders, trampling soldiers. Pack animals went over the edge of the narrow path, tumbling into ravines with supply loads intact. The column compressed as soldiers scrambled away from falling rocks, and in that compression, more men were pushed off the path to their deaths. The elephants panicked completely. The lead bull trumpeted in fear as boulders smashed into the ground nearby. He reared back, crashing into the elephant behind him, creating a chain reaction of terrified animals. Handlers screamed commands that the elephants ignored. One female bolted forward, trampling through packed infantry, leaving crushed bodies in her wake. Another tried to turn around in a space barely wide enough for her body, nearly shoving herself off the cliff edge before handlers managed to calm her. Night fell with the battle still raging on the heights. The gorge became a nightmare landscape of darkness, screaming, and death. Soldiers couldn't see threats coming. Wounded men called for help that couldn't reach them. The Alabros who remained used the darkness to their advantage, rolling more rocks, throwing spears at sounds rather than visible targets. Hannibal's troops on the heights fought by moonlight and instinct, unable to tell friend from enemy in the shadows. Hannibal made a brutal decision. He couldn't secure the gorge safely in darkness with half his army still in the killing zone. Instead, he led his heavy infantry up a parallel route, climbing in the dark, using ropes to scale the steepest sections. They bypassed the gorge entirely, aiming for the Alabroj town that his scouts had located earlier. If he couldn't fight through the ambush, he'd strike at its source. The climb took all night. Soldiers hauled themselves up near vertical rock faces, armour clanking, weapons scraping stone. Several lost their grip and fell, tumbling into darkness without a sound after the initial scream. Others collapsed from exhaustion and had to be dragged forward by comrades. Hannibal climbed with them, leading from the front, his presence driving them onward when muscles and willpower failed. Dawn revealed their position, directly above the Alabroj settlement. The town sat in a mountain valley. Stone buildings clustered around a central square. Walls built to defend against rival tribes, but not against an attack from the cliffs above. Most of the warriors were still at the ambush site or scattered in the mountains. The town held mostly women, children, elderly, and the chief with his personal guards. Hannibal's force descended like an avalanche. They crashed into the town from an impossible direction, overwhelming the minimal defences in minutes. The chief died fighting in his own hall, cut down by Libyan spearmen. His guards tried to form a defence around the grain stores and livestock pens, but were surrounded and slaughtered. Within an hour, Hannibal controlled the entire settlement and everything in it. Food, weapons, warm clothing, and most importantly, hostages. Down in the gorge, the Alabrog's warriors saw smoke rising from their home. They abandoned their positions immediately, racing back to save their families. The ambush collapsed. Carthaginian troops on the heights pursued them viciously, cutting down stragglers, driving the rest into the wilderness. By mid-morning, the gorge was secure. The column began moving again, stepping over bodies and around bloodstains. The cost became clear as officers counted the dead. Over 800 soldiers killed in the ambush, most crushed by boulders or pushed off cliffs. Another 400 wounded, many seriously enough that they couldn't continue. Dozens of pack animals lost with irreplaceable supplies, medical equipment, spare weapons, food reserves. 2 more elephants dead, one crushed by a boulder, another that panicked and fell off the path in darkness. The captured Alabroj's town provided crucial supplies. Hannibal's quartermasters found enough grain to feed the army for a week. Herds of sheep and goats, stores of smoked meat, and, most valuable, warm woolen clothing designed for mountain winters. Soldiers stripped the town of anything useful. The hostages were held briefly, then released with a message. Any further attacks would result in total annihilation of Alabridge's settlements. The tribe got the message and melted into the mountains. The army rested in the captured town for 2 days, recovering from the ambush and preparing for what came next. Hannibal interrogated the few remaining guides, checking their information against captured maps and local knowledge. The path ahead climbed higher, much higher, into regions where snow never melted and the air grew too thin to breathe properly. Some of the African soldiers had never seen snow. They were about to march through miles of it. Temperature became the new enemy. Even in early October, nighttime temperatures in the high valleys dropped below freezing. Soldiers from Libya and Spain, accustomed to Mediterranean climates, woke with ice in their beards and frost on their blankets. The Numidian horses suffered terribly. They'd been bred for desert heat and speed, not cold endurance. Handlers wrapped them in captured wool, but several horses died each night simply from the cold. The path narrowed even further as they climbed. What had been a difficult track became barely a ledge carved into cliff faces. Pack animals had to be led single file, and even then the footing was treacherous. The elephants required special handling at every tight spot. Their bulk made sharp turns nearly impossible. Handlers sometimes spent an hour coaxing one elephant around a single bend in the path. Altitude sickness struck without warning. Soldiers who'd been fine suddenly collapsed, gasping for air that wouldn't satisfy their lungs. Some vomited uncontrollably. Others developed splitting headaches that made thinking impossible. The army's doctors had no treatment. They'd never encountered this malady before. The only cure was descending to lower altitudes, which wasn't an option. Affected soldiers either recovered or died. Most recovered, but weakened. The first serious snowfall hit on the 4th day in the mountains. It started as light flurries, almost beautiful, then intensified into a blinding storm that reduced visibility to a few feet. The column halted wherever soldiers stood when the storm struck, unable to move forward safely. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat, trying to keep the wind from stealing what little heat they generated. The elephants stood miserably, handlers brushing snow off them constantly to prevent dangerous accumulation. When the storm cleared after 6 hours, it revealed a transformed landscape. Snow covered the path completely, hiding edges and drops. The column had to move even more slowly, soldiers probing ahead with spears to find solid ground versus empty air. 3 men stepped confidently onto what looked like snow-covered path and fell through into nothingness. The snow had bridged across gaps, creating false ground that collapsed under weight. Local wildlife provided constant reminders of the danger. The army passed frozen corpses of mountain goats that had fallen from cliffs, their bodies preserved perfectly by the cold. Eagle nests lined some cliff faces, the birds watching the struggling humans with apparent curiosity. Wolves howled at night from nearby peaks, following the army, waiting for stragglers. Any soldier who fell behind or wandered from the column disappeared, sometimes leaving only bloodstains in the snow. The guides who'd survived the Alabridge betrayal now pointed toward the highest pass, a gap between 2 massive peaks where the path climbed to its maximum altitude. From the foothills, the pass looked impossible, a thin line against the sky where rock and ice met clouds. But it was the most direct route to Italy, and speed mattered more than safety. Every day in the mountains was another day for weather to worsen, supplies to dwindle, and men to die from exposure. Hannibal ordered the army to prepare for the worst climbing yet. Soldiers checked ropes, redistributed the heaviest equipment to the strongest men, and said quiet farewells to friends in case they didn't survive. The elephants were given double rations. They'd need every ounce of strength for the ascent. Officers moved through the ranks, identifying the weaker soldiers and sending them to the middle of the column where they'd have maximum protection. The ascent to the high pass began at dawn. Within 2 hours, soldiers were gasping from thin air and brutal effort. The path switchbacked up near vertical slopes, gaining altitude so rapidly that the valleys below became toy landscapes. One wrong step, one moment of inattention, one loose rock, any of these meant death. The mountain didn't care about courage or skill. It killed impartially and constantly. The summit pass appeared deceptively close, a notch between two peaks that seemed only hours away. 3 days of brutal climbing later, it still looked hours away. Distance meant nothing at this altitude where the thin air made every step an exercise in controlled suffering. Soldiers counted breaths instead of paces, lungs burning as they struggled to extract oxygen from air that felt empty. The path deteriorated into suggestions of routes rather than actual trails. Ancient rock slides had destroyed sections completely, forcing the engineers to improvise bridges using ropes and logs carried specifically for this purpose. Each temporary crossing had to support not just men, but fully loaded pack animals and eventually the elephants. Testing these bridges meant sending soldiers across first, hoping the structure would hold, watching helplessly when it didn't. Frostbite claimed its first victims on the 6th day above the snow line. A Numidian cavalryman woke to find his toes black and hard as stone. The army doctors amputated immediately, cutting through frozen flesh with heated blades while the soldier bit down on leather to muffle his screams. 6 more amputations followed that day, then 12 the next. Soldiers who'd sweated through summers in Spain now watched their extremities die from cold, the tissue turning dark and dead while they still lived. The elephants suffered their own torments. Their feet, designed for African savanna, split and cracked on the ice-covered rocks. Handlers wrapped them in cloth and leather, creating primitive boots that lasted mere hours before shredding. Blood marked the elephant's passage, frozen pink on white snow. Several animals developed infections in their feet, limping badly, slowing the entire column. The handlers debated killing the weakest elephants to spare them suffering, but Hannibal refused. Every elephant that reached Italy justified the losses in getting them there. The column stretched over 8 miles now, scattered across multiple switchbacks and elevation changes. Soldiers at the front experienced completely different weather than those at the rear. Communication became nearly impossible. Runners carrying messages had to climb or descend for hours to reach their destinations, and by then conditions had often changed. Hannibal rode the length of the column daily, a grueling journey that took 12 hours, maintaining his presence and authority through sheer physical endurance. On the 9th day in the mountains, scouts brought devastating news. The highest pass was blocked. An avalanche, either recent or from last winter, had completely covered the path with compacted snow and ice. The blockage extended for roughly 300 yards, spanning the narrowest and steepest section of the pass. The snow had frozen into something approaching solid ice, smooth and impassable. Pack animals couldn't cross it. They'd slip and fall immediately. The elephants had no chance whatsoever. Hannibal climbed to see the obstruction himself. The blockage gleamed in afternoon sun, a river of ice flowing across the only viable path. To the left, vertical cliffs rose hundreds of feet. To the right, a drop into nothingness. No alternate route existed. Going back meant descending for days, finding a different pass, and climbing again. A delay that would put them in the Alps when the serious winter storms hit. His army would die. The engineers proposed a solution that sounded like madness. They would clear the blockage manually, cutting through the ice and snow to create a path wide enough for the column. The method would combine fire and vinegar, an ancient technique for breaking stone. They'd build massive fires on the ice surface to heat it, then douse the heated areas with vinegar. The rapid temperature change would crack the ice, allowing workers to break it apart and clear it away. The immediate problem was fuel. The army had climbed above the tree line days ago. No wood existed at this altitude beyond the twisted, stunted shrubs that clung to protected crevices. Hannibal ordered every available man to descend below the snow line and bring back wood. Every branch, every fallen tree, every scrap of burnable material they could carry. Thousands of soldiers stumbled down the mountain they'd spent days climbing, then stumbled back up with loads of wood that weighed them down nearly to collapse. The work began that afternoon and continued without pause. Engineers divided the blockage into sections, assigned crews to each section, and started fires. The flames looked absurd against the mountain backdrop, tiny orange spots on a landscape of white and grey. The heat barely seemed to affect the ice at first. Water ran in thin streams, then refroze immediately in the brutal cold. But the engineers kept building fires, feeding them constantly, creating enough heat to make a difference. Vinegar came from the army supply reserves, thousands of amphorae carried from Spain for preserving food and treating wounds. Now it served an entirely different purpose. When the ice heated sufficiently, crews poured vinegar over it in massive quantities. The chemical reaction and thermal shock cracked the ice, with sounds like breaking bones. Workers immediately attacked the fractured ice with picks and shovels, breaking it into pieces small enough to throw off the cliff edge. Progress measured in feet per day. The blockage stretched 300 yards, and each yard required hours of heating, vinegar treatment, and physical braking. Soldiers worked in shifts around the clock, the fires creating small islands of warmth in an otherwise lethal cold. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were dragged aside to recover while fresh workers took their places. The constant effort became hypnotic. Feed fire, pour vinegar, break ice, throw debris, repeat. Meanwhile, the rest of the army waited in increasingly desperate conditions. They couldn't advance past the blockage, couldn't retreat without abandoning the effort, couldn't even spread out to safer positions. The path was too narrow. They camped on slopes and ledges, clinging to the mountain, losing men each night to exposure and accidents. Food supplies dwindled catastrophically. The plan had assumed moving quickly through the mountains, not a 3-day halt for engineering work. Soldiers began slaughtering pack animals for food. Horses went first, then mules, then the oxen that had hauled heavy equipment. Each animal killed reduced the army's carrying capacity, which meant more supplies had to be abandoned, which meant future starvation became more likely. But men were starving now, and now mattered more than later. Fresh meat, even from exhausted animals, provided calories and warmth. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled for marrow, hides were stripped for leather, organs were eaten immediately before they could freeze. Disease followed starvation like a faithful companion. Dysentery struck first, spreading through the packed soldiers with terrifying speed. Men couldn't leave their positions to find proper latrines. The slopes were too steep, the cold too intense. The results were predictable and disgusting. Then came respiratory infections, soldiers coughing blood into the snow, their lungs damaged by breathing thin, frozen air for days on end. The doctors ran out of medicine, then improvised with wine and prayers, then could only watch men die. The elephants grew dangerously weak. Their handlers had been feeding them double rations, but those rations had run out. Now the great beasts subsisted on whatever vegetation the handlers could find, supplemented by grain diverted from human supplies. It wasn't enough. The elephants lost weight visibly, their ribs showing through skin, their movements becoming lethargic. One bull lay down and refused to stand despite his handler's desperate efforts. He died overnight, frozen solid by morning, another massive corpse the army had to abandon. Desertions began on the 11th day. Small groups of soldiers simply walked away, heading back down the mountain, choosing possible death from cold and wolves over certain death from starvation at this frozen altitude. Officers tried stopping them, but you couldn't force men to stay and die. Some deserters made it back to Gallic settlements and survived. Most died in the mountains, their frozen bodies found weeks later by travellers. Hannibal executed no one for desertion. He understood the calculus his soldiers faced, understood that their loyalty had limits, understood that pushing harder might trigger mass desertion that would collapse the entire army. Instead, he offered incentives to those who stayed. Promises of riches in Italy, land grants, bonuses from the first Roman city they captured. He gambled that greed would overcome fear, and for most soldiers, it did. The breakthrough came on the third day of engineering work. The crews had cleared a path through the first 100 yards of blockage, a narrow channel barely wide enough for loaded pack animals. It was enough. Hannibal ordered the column to begin moving immediately, before weather could worsen or the cleared path could refreeze. The vanguard started forward while crews continued working on the remaining sections. Getting the elephants across required desperate innovation. The handlers created a layer of dirt and gravel over the cleared ice, giving the animals better footing. Each elephant was led individually, handlers guiding them step by careful step. The bull who'd survived longest, Surus, went first. He placed each massive foot tentatively, testing the surface, his trunk extended for balance. The crossing took 45 agonizing minutes. Behind him, the path showed cracks from his weight. The handlers realized they needed to space the elephants far apart to avoid catastrophic collapse. 2 elephants refused to cross. They stood at the edge of the cleared section, trumpeting in fear, backing away from handlers who tried to coax them forward. Hours of effort produced nothing but exhausted handlers and increasingly panicked animals. Finally, Hannibal made the brutal decision. The elephants were killed where they stood, their meat immediately distributed to starving soldiers. The handlers wept as they cut their animals apart, but hunger outweighed sentiment. The crossing took another full day as the entire column filed through the narrow gap. Soldiers moved in single file pressed against the cliff face, trying not to look at the drop on their right. Pack animals slipped regularly on the icy surface despite the gravel layer. Those that fell took their loads with them, tons of supplies vanishing into the abyss. The sound of their falling, first the initial crash, then the diminishing echoes, haunted everyone who heard it. The last elements of the army cleared the blockage as the sun set on the 12th day in the mountains. Behind them lay an engineering marvel, a path carved through ice by fire and acid and desperate human effort. Ahead lay the descent into Italy, which everyone assumed would be easier than the climb. They crossed the highest point, survived the worst the Alps could offer, endured conditions that had killed thousands of their comrades. The worst was over. They were catastrophically wrong. The descent path revealed itself as a cruel joke. Where the ascent had been steep but relatively stable, the downward route consisted of shattered rock and loose scree that shifted under every footstep. The angle was steeper, the exposure more extreme, the consequences of mistakes more immediately fatal. Gravity, which had fought them on the way up, now became an active enemy trying to pull them over the edge. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the treacherous surface with a deceptive blanket of white. What looked like solid ground was often loose rocks barely held in place by friction. Soldiers stepping confidently onto snow-covered slopes triggered miniature avalanches that carried them downward in chaotic tumbles. Some managed to arrest their slides by grabbing at rocks or driving weapons into cracks. Others accelerated until they shot off cliff edges, their screams marking their trajectory until impact silenced them. The first major casualty came within an hour of starting the descent. A pack mule loaded with medical supplies slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath snow. The animal stumbled, tried to regain footing, failed, and toppled sideways off the path. Its load shifted, unbalancing it further, and the mule rolled down the slope, gathering speed until it vanished from sight. The crash echoed up from far below. Every medicine, bandage, and surgical tool the army still possessed disappeared with that single animal. Hannibal ordered ropes deployed immediately. Soldiers tied themselves together in groups of 5, creating human chains that distributed risk. If one man fell, the others could anchor him, theoretically preventing total loss. The system worked occasionally. More often, one falling soldier pulled down his entire group, 5 men tumbling together until the rope snapped or they all went over an edge. The screaming became constant background noise, punctuated by the crack of breaking ropes and the thud of bodies striking stone. The elephants faced an impossible situation. Their weight, which had made climbing difficult, made descending potentially suicidal. Each step required them to trust that the ground ahead would support tons of mass moving downhill. The handlers led them along the widest sections of path, but even there, the footing was uncertain. The led elephant, Suris, moved with extreme caution, testing each step before committing his weight. Behind him, other elephants mimicked his careful progress. Then the path dropped away entirely. A section roughly 50 feet long had collapsed, probably during spring thaw, leaving a gap where solid trail should have been. Below the gap, the slope continued at an even steeper angle, covered in loose rock and snow. Above, sheer cliff face offered no alternate route. The army faced a choice: find another way down which might not exist, or navigate this lethal obstacle. The engineers rigged a desperate solution. They drove wooden stakes deep into cracks in the rock, then attached ropes to create a sort of rope bridge across the gap. Light infantry crossed first, testing the system, several falling when stakes pulled loose or ropes snapped under load. Once enough men reached the far side, they secured additional ropes from that end, creating a marginally more stable crossing. Soldiers crawled across one at a time, clinging to ropes, trying not to look down at the vertical drop beneath them. Pack animals couldn't use ropes. The only option was to send them down the slope below the gap and hope they survived to rejoin the path farther down. Handlers cut the animals loose and slapped them forward. Some mules and horses managed to pick their way down the treacherous slope, sliding and scrambling but staying upright. Others lost footing immediately and rolled, their bodies breaking apart on rocks, creating grotesque trails of blood and debris. Roughly half the remaining pack animals died in this single obstacle. The elephants couldn't cross the rope bridge and couldn't be sent down the slope. They'd die instantly. Handlers spent hours examining every possible option, finding nothing viable. Hannibal finally accepted reality. The elephants would have to go around, following a longer, lower route that scouts reported might be passable. This meant splitting his forces, the main army continuing on the direct but deadly path, while the elephants and their handlers took a detour that would add days to their journey. 28 elephants remained alive. Their separation from the main column felt like abandoning children. The handlers led them away along a narrow trail that curved around the mountain's flank, disappearing from sight within an hour. Whether they'd survive to rejoin the army was unknowable. Hannibal watched them go, calculating odds, accepting losses, understanding that everything was a gamble now. The main column pressed downward into worsening conditions. New snow began falling, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The path, already nearly invisible, became completely obscured. Soldiers at the front probed ahead with spears, testing for solid ground, finding empty air as often as rock. The column compressed as everyone slowed to near immobility, which meant those at the rear stopped completely, standing in the killing cold while progress crawled forward. Hypothermia killed efficiently at this point. Soldiers who sat down to rest simply didn't stand up again. Their bodies cooled, their minds fogged, and they slipped into unconsciousness that transitioned seamlessly into death. Officers moved constantly through the ranks, forcing men to keep moving, physically dragging those who'd stopped. But the officers were just as exhausted, just as cold, just as close to their own limits. A Numidian cavalry unit, 30 men who'd survived everything the Alps had thrown at them, reached a section where the path narrowed to barely 2 feet wide. They had to move single file, leading their horses, pressed against the cliff face with nothingness on their right. Halfway through, one horse panicked. It reared, striking the man in front of it, causing him to lose balance. He grabbed for support and caught his companion's cloak. Both men went over the edge. Their horse, still panicked, backed into the horse behind, which bucked and kicked, hitting its own handler. Within seconds, the entire cavalry unit was struggling in a confined space, with panicked animals and no room to maneuver. 15 men and all 30 horses fell to their deaths. The survivors could only press themselves against the cliff and wait for the chaos to end. Frostbite advanced from fingers and toes to hands and feet. Soldiers lost feeling in their extremities, couldn't grip weapons, couldn't feel the ground beneath them. Officers performed brutal triage. Those with blackened hands or feet that would lead to death from infection were separated from those who might survive with amputations. The infected were left behind with a day's rations and weapons to defend themselves. Everyone understood this meant death, but it was death they'd choose the timing of rather than death that came from infection and agony. Some of the abandoned men thanked their commanders before being left to the mountain. The descent gradient steepened further into what was essentially a controlled fall. Soldiers sat and slid, using their feet to brake and steer, their clothing shredding on the rocks, skin beneath the clothing doing the same. The Libyan heavy infantry, equipped with bronze armour that had served them well in Mediterranean warfare, found their protection becoming a liability. The metal conducted cold directly to their skin, causing frost damage faster than leather or cloth would. Many stripped off their armour and abandoned it, centuries of Carthaginian military tradition discarded on a mountain because survival outweighed pride. Food supplies reached critical levels. The army had consumed or lost almost everything in the crossing and the high pass delay. What remained was strictly rationed, a handful of grain per man per day, barely enough to sustain life, nowhere near enough to sustain men engaged in extreme physical labour in brutal cold. Soldiers boiled leather equipment to make it chewable, consuming their own sandals and belts. They ate pine needles and bark from the twisted trees that grew in sheltered areas. Some resorted to eating snow for its water content, which caused violent cramps and further body cooling. Disease exploded through the weakened army. Pneumonia claimed dozens daily, their lungs filling with fluid, drowning them from within. Dysentery, never fully contained, intensified as sanitation became impossible on narrow mountain paths. Men developed mysterious fevers that burned them from inside while outside they froze. The doctors, working without medicine or supplies, could only watch the dying and try to comfort them. Some soldiers died with their eyes open, frozen in place mid-step, too exhausted to even close their eyes in death. A 3-day storm struck without warning on the 14th day in the mountains. Wind powerful enough to knock men off their feet combined with snow so thick that soldiers couldn't see their own hands extended at arm's length. The column halted wherever it stood, unable to move forward or backward safely. Men huddled in whatever shelter they could find, behind rocks, in crevices, pressed together in desperate masses trying to share body heat. the storm killed hundreds simply through exposure. When it cleared, the survivors had to climb over frozen corpses to continue the descent. The psychological toll exceeded the physical damage. Soldiers who'd been confident professional warriors in Spain now moved like traumatized refugees. They stopped speaking, stopped making eye contact, stopped reacting to death around them. A kind of numbness set in, not the numbness of cold, but the numbness of minds overloaded by horror and loss. Officers tried to maintain discipline and morale, but their own trauma showed through the attempted encouragement. Desertions increased dramatically despite having nowhere to desert to. Small groups simply stopped following the column, choosing instead to find shelter and wait for death on their own terms rather than continue the grinding march. Others turned back, attempting to retrace the route to Gaul, preferring the slim chance of survival going backward to the certainty of suffering going forward. Most deserters died within days. A few, impossible to count, might have survived to tell stories in Gallic villages about the madman who tried to cross the Alps with elephants. The army's ethnic cohesion began fraying. Libyans blamed Spanish troops for moving too slowly. Spanish troops blamed Numidians for losing horses that could have carried supplies. Gallic auxiliaries, who joined expecting glory and loot, muttered about betrayal and impossible promises. Carthaginian officers struggled to prevent the army from fragmenting into hostile ethnic groups that would fight each other as readily as they'd fought together. Only Hannibal's presence, his constant movement through the ranks, his sharing of every hardship, kept the army functioning as a unit. On the 15th day, scouts at the front finally saw something besides mountains and snow. Green. Valley below, trees, grass, the Po River plains spreading out like a promised land. Italy, the destination they'd bled and frozen and died to reach. Word spread backward through the column faster than any runner could carry it. Soldiers began moving with renewed energy, pain and exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of salvation visible below. But between them and Italy lay the final descent, the steepest, most damaged section of path, where spring avalanches had destroyed any pretense of a maintained trail. The mountain wasn't finished killing them yet. The final slope descended at an angle that defied rational path construction. Whoever had originally carved this trail had created something functional for summer travellers, not armies descending in snow with the mountain actively trying to kill them. The surface consisted of ice layered over loose rock, creating a skating rink tilted toward oblivion. Every step required absolute concentration, and concentration was a luxury exhausted men couldn't afford. The first soldier to reach the bottom arrived as a corpse. He'd stepped onto what looked like stable snow, broken through into a hidden crevasse, and fallen 30 feet onto rocks. His body marked the route's dangers more effectively than any scout's warning. The column diverted around the crevasse, only to encounter another 100 feet farther on. The mountain had fractured beneath its snow covering, creating a maze of death traps invisible until someone fell into them. Hannibal ordered the engineers to mark safe routes using spears thrust into the snow at regular intervals. Soldiers followed these markers religiously, moving in a single file line that stretched for miles. The system worked until a section of slope collapsed beneath its own weight, taking markers and the soldiers following them into a cascading avalanche of snow, rock, and screaming men. 37 soldiers disappeared in seconds. The markers resumed beyond the collapsed section, but trust in them never fully recovered. The elephants rejoined the main column mid-descent, appearing around a bend like apparitions from another world. 26 remained alive. 2 had died on the alternate route from injuries and exhaustion. The sight of the massive beasts restored morale more effectively than any speech could. Soldiers who'd been moving mechanically suddenly stood straighter, managed smiles, called out greetings to the handlers. The elephants represented continuity and success. If these animals could survive, humans could too. Temperature began rising as altitude decreased, which created new hazards instead of relief. The warming caused snow to become unstable, triggering small avalanches throughout the day. Ice that had been solid turned slippery with meltwater. Sections of path that had been passable in the morning became impassable by afternoon, as ice turned to slush and slush undermined the rocks beneath. The army raced against the daily warming cycle, trying to cover maximum distance while conditions remained frozen, then finding shelter before the thaw made movement suicidal. The sick and wounded presented an impossible logistics problem. Hundreds of soldiers could barely walk, slowed by injuries, disease, or frostbite damage. Officers had to choose continuously between leaving the weakest behind or slowing the entire column to accommodate them. Hannibal refused to abandon soldiers who could still move under their own power, which meant the column's pace matched its slowest elements. This decision saved lives at the cost of prolonging everyone's exposure to the killing environment. Wildlife returned as they descended below the permanent snowline. Mountain goats watched from impossible perches. Eagles circled overhead, tracking the column, waiting for the dying. Wolves appeared at dusk, maintaining careful distance but following persistently. The army was too large and still too organized to attack directly, but stragglers and soldiers who wandered from the column vanished with regularity. Guards found blood trails in the morning, sometimes partial remains, usually nothing at all. A messenger from the rear guard brought news that changed everything. A group of local tribesmen, Salassi warriors who controlled these lower approaches, had been shadowing the column for 2 days. They hadn't attacked yet, but they were gathering strength, waiting for the right moment. The Carthaginian army, despite its losses, still numbered over 30,000 men. But those men were starving, exhausted, poorly armed after abandoning equipment, and strung out across miles of mountain trail. The Salassi saw opportunity in suffering. Hannibal dispatched his remaining cavalry, barely 4,000 Numidians who still had living horses, to screen the rear and flanks. They rode ahead to scout the path into the foothills, looking for defensible positions where the army could rest and reorganize. What they found was more dangerous than the mountains, a narrow gorge that the trail threaded through, perfect for ambush, completely unavoidable. The Salassi almost certainly controlled the high ground there. Passing through would mean fighting while trapped in a killing zone. The alternative was a longer route around the gorge that would add 3 more days to the descent. 3 days the army couldn't afford. Supplies had reached the point where men were surviving on nothing but melted snow and hope. 3 more days would kill hundreds more from starvation alone. Speed or safety? Hannibal couldn't have both. He chose speed, gambling that momentum and desperation would carry them through whatever ambush waited. The column compressed as soldiers prepared for battle. Weapons that had been packed away were distributed. Spears that had been used as walking sticks became combat equipment again. Shields too damaged to fight with effectively were discarded. Armour was redistributed to the healthier soldiers who'd have the best chance of surviving close combat. The Carthaginian war machine, broken down and scattered across weeks of mountain hell, tried to reconstitute itself into something capable of violence. The gorge appeared suddenly. The path simply dropped into a slot canyon carved by ancient water. Walls rose vertically on both sides, narrowing to barely wide enough for loaded pack animals. The trail at the bottom was rocky but relatively flat, the first easy walking the army had encountered in days. It looked like a gift. It was a trap. Stones began falling from above before the vanguard was halfway through. Not an avalanche, not an accident. Deliberate attack. Salassi warriors on the canyon rim rolled boulders over the edge, letting gravity turn them into killing weapons. The rocks bounced off walls, fragmenting into deadly shrapnel, crashing into the packed column with devastating results. Men were crushed, limbs shattered, skulls split. The column compressed further as soldiers scrambled for the limited cover available. Javelins followed the stones, hundreds of them, thrown from positions where the Selassie could see targets, but the Carthaginians couldn't return fire effectively. Soldiers raised shields, but many had abandoned them in the mountains. The javelins found unprotected flesh, punching through clothing and skin, pinning men to the ground. Screams echoed off the canyon walls, magnified and distorted, creating a nightmare soundscape that made organization impossible. Hannibal didn't retreat. Retreating meant dying in the mountains, and his soldiers knew it. Instead, he ordered light infantry to scale the canyon walls under fire, climbing vertical rock while being targeted by every enemy who could see them. The Balearic slingers went first, their lead bullets providing covering fire with lethal accuracy. Spanish troops followed, finding handholds in cracks, hauling themselves upward despite exhaustion and injuries, driven by rage at being trapped and slaughtered. The fighting on the canyon rim was brief and savage. Carthaginian soldiers who reached the top were outnumbered but infinitely more experienced. They'd survived weeks that would have killed the Selassie in days. They fought with the desperation of men who'd endured too much to die at the threshold of survival. Slingers dropped warriors from 20 paces. Spanish infantry closed with swords and knives, fighting with technical precision against brave but outmatched tribesmen. The Selassie broke within an hour. They'd expected to massacre a defeated army, not face soldiers who fought like cornered wolves. The survivors fled into the hills, abandoning their positions, leaving their dead behind. Carthaginian troops pursued just far enough to secure the canyon rim, then stopped. They lacked the energy for extended pursuit. The column resumed moving through the gorge, stepping over bodies and bloodstains, the wounded screaming for help that often came too late. The army emerged from the mountains on October 28th, 15 days after entering them. Officers conducted a count that revealed catastrophic losses. Roughly 20,000 infantry remained of the 50,000 that had started from New Carthage. About 6,000 cavalry survived from the original 9,000. 24 elephants lived, though several were so sick or injured they'd likely die within days. Over half the pack animals were gone. Medical supplies, food reserves, spare weapons, tents, all lost in the mountains or abandoned to save weight. The survivors looked like they'd fought a war and lost. Emaciated bodies, frost-bitten extremities wrapped in filthy bandages, clothes reduced to rags, armour dented and damaged, weapons nicked and dulled. Many had lost fingers or toes to the cold. Others carried wounds from falls, attacks, or accidents. Everyone had the 1,000-yard stare of people who'd seen too much death too close. They'd crossed the uncrossable, survived the unsurvivable, and paid for it with blood and flesh and sanity. The Po River Valley spread before them, flat agricultural land, villages with smoke rising from cooking fires, roads connecting settlements, visible civilization after weeks of frozen wilderness. The Insubres and Boii tribes, Celtic peoples who hated Roman rule, controlled this territory. They'd promised Hannibal support and supplies. Messengers galloped ahead to announce the army's arrival and request immediate assistance. The Celtic response exceeded expectations. Within 2 days, supply wagons arrived loaded with bread, meat, wine, cheese, grain, vegetables, real food in quantities the soldiers had almost forgotten existed. Healers came with herbs and medicines. Fresh clothing appeared, wool and leather appropriate for northern Italian autumn. Weapons were offered to replace those lost in the mountains. Most importantly, the tribes offered shelter and rest in their settlements. Hannibal allowed his army 2 weeks to recover. Soldiers ate until their shrunken stomachs couldn't hold more, then slept for days. The injured received treatment from Celtic healers who, while not formally trained, had extensive experience with wounds and infections. Amputations were performed properly instead of in freezing mountain passes. The elephants were fed, sheltered, and cared for by handlers who wept with relief at having facilities to work with. Slowly, the survivors began resembling soldiers instead of refugees. Celtic warriors arrived to join the army. The Insubras and Boii had been waiting for someone to challenge Rome, and Hannibal's impossible mountain crossing proved he was that someone. Young men eager for glory, veterans seeking revenge for Roman oppression, entire war bands looking for loot, they flooded into the Carthaginian camps. Within 10 days, Hannibal commanded roughly 40,000 troops again, though now the majority were Gauls rather than his African and Spanish veterans. News of Hannibal's arrival spread through northern Italy faster than his army could march. Roman settlements panicked. Refugees fled south, carrying exaggerated tales of hundreds of elephants and 100,000 Carthaginian soldiers. The Senate in Rome initially refused to believe the reports. No army could cross the Alps in autumn, especially not with elephants. When confirmation arrived from multiple sources, disbelief turned to shock, then fear, then frantic military mobilization. The Romans dispatched Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same commander who'd missed Hannibal at the Rhone, with a legion to intercept and destroy the Carthaginian army before it could fully recover and recruit more Gauls. Scipio believed he faced a broken force, exhausted and undersupplied, that could be crushed quickly. He was partially right about their condition, but completely wrong about their capability. The armies met at the Ticinus River in early November. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, recovered and reinforced, clashed with Roman cavalry in a vicious engagement that ended with the Romans routed and Scipio himself wounded. The battle was minor by any strategic measure, a skirmish really, but it proved that the army that had crossed the Alps could still fight, could still win, could still threaten Rome itself. The impossible gambit had succeeded. Hannibal stood in Italy with an army, beyond Rome's northern defences, positioned to strike at the Republic's heartland. The cost had been extraordinary. Over 30,000 men dead in the crossing, thousands more crippled or traumatized, irreplaceable equipment abandoned, months of planning and resources invested in a march that killed more soldiers than most battles. But the strategic objective had been achieved. Rome finally understood what they faced. Not just an enemy army, but a commander willing to attempt the impossible and capable of succeeding. The survival of Hannibal's army defied every reasonable military calculation. Armies had attempted Alpine crossings before and failed completely, their remnants straggling back to tell stories of impassable terrain and certain death. Small trading caravans managed the journey in summer with acceptable losses. Military forces numbering in the thousands had never succeeded, and no one had ever tried it with war elephants. Understanding how Hannibal accomplished this requires examining factors beyond simple courage or determination. Timing proved absolutely critical in ways that weren't obvious until analysing the complete picture. October represented the last possible window for crossing, late enough that hostile tribes had harvested crops and were distracted with winter preparations, early enough that the catastrophic winter storms hadn't yet arrived. Cross in August, and every mountain tribe would have fresh warriors ready to contest the passage. Wait until November, and the deep snows would make the high passes completely impassable, even with unlimited time and resources. Hannibal threaded a temporal needle, accepting the risks of early snow to avoid the certainties of tribal resistance and winter fury. The reconnaissance investment distinguished this operation from doomed predecessors. Hannibal hadn't gambled blindly on mountain crossings. His scouts had spent 3 years mapping routes, cataloguing conditions in different seasons, identifying which Gallic tribes could be bribed versus which would fight, locating water sources and potential supply depots. They'd interviewed traders who made regular crossings, interrogated deserters from Roman armies, purchased maps from Celtic chieftains who knew the passes intimately. When the army entered the Alps, Hannibal possessed more information about the terrain than any invader in history. Military discipline provided the organizational foundation that kept the army functioning when any rational group of humans would have disintegrated into panicked mobs. The Libyan heavy infantry formed the disciplined corps, professional soldiers who'd trained together for years, who followed orders even when those orders seemed suicidal, who maintained unit cohesion under conditions that would scatter less experienced troops. These veterans anchored the column, preventing panic from spreading, enforcing march discipline, and providing examples of professional soldiering that the auxiliaries and mercenaries could emulate. The army's ethnic diversity, seemingly a weakness, actually enhanced survival probability through specialized capabilities. Numidian cavalrymen possessed unmatched horsemanship that let them navigate terrain other cavalry couldn't attempt. Spanish troops brought mountain warfare experience from years fighting in the Pyrenees. Balearic slingers provided accurate ranged firepower that conserved precious arrows and javelins. Carthaginian engineers knew construction techniques and siege methods that proved applicable to mountain obstacles. No single ethnic group could have crossed the Alps alone, but the combination created problem-solving capacity that addressed multiple challenges simultaneously. Prepositioned supplies, arranged through years of diplomatic preparation, prevented total starvation during the crossing. Hannibal had sent agents ahead with gold to establish supply caches with friendly Gallic tribes along the planned route. These depots didn't contain enough food to feed 50,000 men indefinitely, but they provided crucial resupply points that extended the army's endurance beyond what carried supplies alone would permit. When the army captured the Allobroges town, they didn't just stumble onto supplies, they seized a pre-planned resupply point they'd known about for months. The elephants themselves, despite being tremendous logistical burdens, served an unexpected psychological function. As long as the elephants kept moving, soldiers believed the march was succeeding. The animals became living symbols of the army's capability. If creatures this massive and unsuited for mountains could continue, then individual soldiers had no excuse to quit. When elephants died, morale dropped noticeably. When they survived obstacles, spirits rose. The handlers understood this dynamic and went to extraordinary lengths to keep elephants alive and visible, knowing their symbolic value exceeded their tactical worth during the crossing. Hannibal's personal leadership style made survival possible in ways formal authority couldn't achieve. He marched at the front of the column during dangerous passages, shared the same rations as common soldiers, slept without shelter when his troops lacked tents, and personally led combat actions against tribal ambushes. Soldiers followed commanders who shared their suffering in ways they'd never follow leaders who commanded from comfort and safety. Multiple sources record instances where soldiers on the edge of desertion continued specifically because Hannibal was visible ahead of them, enduring the same hell they endured. Technical innovation during the crossing exceeded anything planned beforehand. The engineers improvised solutions to problems they'd never imagined, constructing rope bridges across chasms, creating elephant boots from available materials, developing the fire and vinegar technique for clearing ice blockages, designing temporary shelters from rocks and snow. This innovation required both technical knowledge and the freedom to experiment with unorthodox solutions. Hannibal empowered his engineers to try anything that might work, accepting failures as learning opportunities rather than punishing unsuccessful experiments. The decision to split forces when necessary, sending elephants on alternate routes, dispatching Hanno's force upstream at the Rhone, dividing troops to secure high ground during tribal ambushes, demonstrated tactical flexibility that rigid military doctrine would have prevented. Many commanders would have insisted on keeping the army concentrated for security. Hannibal understood that concentration increased vulnerability in mountain terrain, where smaller, more mobile forces could achieve objectives that massive formations couldn't attempt. Brutal triage decisions, made continuously throughout the crossing, maximised survival rates for those who could be saved, leaving behind soldiers too injured or sick to continue, abandoning equipment that slowed the march, killing elephants that couldn't cross obstacles, executing deserters when necessary to prevent mass defections. These choices were morally terrible but practically essential. Commanders who couldn't make such decisions lost entire armies trying to save everyone. Hannibal sacrificed parts to preserve the whole. Weather luck played an undeniable role. The crossing could have been much worse. Major storms could have struck during critical passages. Avalanches could have buried entire sections of the column. Temperatures could have dropped even lower. The autumn of 218 BC was harsh, but not exceptional by Alpine standards. Hannibal benefited from weather that was merely terrible rather than catastrophic. This luck wasn't the result of planning, but planning created the conditions where luck could matter, arriving at the right time to benefit from whatever fortune offered. The Roman failure to intercept the army at vulnerable points proved strategically decisive. Scipio's near miss at the Rhone represented Rome's best opportunity to destroy Hannibal before he reached the mountains. A 2-day earlier arrival would have caught the Carthaginians divided by the river, unable to concentrate forces, vulnerable to attack from both Scipio and the Volcae simultaneously. Instead, Scipio arrived late, found empty camps, and made the strategic error of returning to Italy by sea, rather than pursuing into the mountains where terrain would favour ambush. The psychological factor of having no alternative cannot be overstated. Once the army entered the Alps, retreat became nearly as dangerous as advance. The tribes behind them knew the army's weakened state and would attack a retreating force with less caution. Returning meant admitting failure and facing the consequences in Carthage, where Hannibal's political enemies would exploit the disaster. The soldiers understood, perhaps subconsciously, that forward was the only direction that offered any hope of survival. This eliminated the constant psychological drain of second-guessing the mission. They were committed absolutely. Training programs implemented in Spain during the years before the march had prepared soldiers physically and mentally for extreme conditions. Hannibal had forced his troops to conduct training marches in the Pyrenees, acclimating them to mountain terrain, altitude, and cold. He deliberately recruited from regions that provided hardy soldiers used to hardship: North African tribesmen, Spanish mountain fighters, Celtic warriors from cold climates. The army that entered the Alps wasn't composed of soft city soldiers, but of men who'd been systematically prepared for environmental extremes. Medical knowledge, primitive by modern standards but advanced for the ancient world, prevented some deaths that would have been inevitable with worse treatment. Carthaginian doctors understood basic wound treatment, recognized infections, knew which herbs reduced fever and pain, and performed amputations when necessary to save lives. Their survival rate wasn't high, but it was significantly better than no medical intervention at all. The decision to carry medical supplies and doctors despite the weight burden reflected Hannibal's understanding that keeping soldiers alive maintained combat power. Communication systems that worked despite the scattered column prevented the army from fragmentating into lost units. Runners carried messages continuously, maintaining contact between vanguard and rear guard, even when they were separated by hours of marching. Officers knew where other units were positioned, what obstacles they faced, and what assistance they needed. This communication prevented duplication of effort and ensured resources went where they'd have maximum effect. Without it, the column would have broken into isolated groups that would have been destroyed separately. The promise of extraordinary rewards in Italy sustained motivation when physical conditions would have broken weaker resolve. Hannibal had spent years telling his soldiers about Roman wealth, describing the riches waiting in Italian cities, promising land grants and citizenship rights. These weren't empty promises. He had the political authority to deliver, and soldiers believed him. The vision of wealth and status beyond anything possible in their home regions kept them moving when death would have been easier than another step. Celtic tribal politics created opportunities Hannibal exploited brilliantly. The Gauls weren't unified. They were dozens of tribes with complex alliances, rivalries, and hatreds. Rome had been systematically conquering and subjugating these tribes for decades, creating enormous resentment. Hannibal positioned himself as a liberator and potential ally against Roman imperialism. The tribes that joined him weren't doing it out of love for Carthage, but hatred for Rome. This political calculation provided the final crucial element: reinforcements and supplies waiting in Italy that transformed survivors into an army capable of fighting. The combination of all these factors — timing, reconnaissance, discipline, diversity, supplies, symbolism, leadership, innovation, flexibility, triage, weather, enemy failures, psychology, training, medicine, communication, motivation, and politics — created survival where any single factor alone would have been insufficient. Remove reconnaissance, and they'd have chosen impassable routes. Remove leadership, and discipline would have collapsed. Remove supplies, and starvation would have killed everyone. Remove weather luck, and storms would have buried the column. Hannibal succeeded because he understood that impossible military operations require addressing hundreds of details simultaneously. Every factor had to work, every calculation had to be correct, every decision had to serve the larger strategic objective. The margin for error was zero. He'd gambled everything on this crossing, and through planning, leadership, innovation, and luck in equal measures, the gamble had paid off. The survivors who emerged from the Alps weren't the same army that had entered. They were harder, more experienced, absolutely loyal to a commander who'd led them through hell and convinced they were capable of anything. Rome was about to discover what an army that had survived the impossible could accomplish when properly employed on a battlefield. The Battle of Trebia came in December, barely 6 weeks after the mountain crossing. Hannibal lured the Roman consul Sempronius Longus into attacking across a frozen river at dawn with soldiers who hadn't eaten breakfast against an enemy who'd prepared the battlefield meticulously. The Carthaginian army, reinforced with Gallic warriors but still containing the Alpine survivors at its core, annihilated 2 full Roman legions. Over 20,000 Roman soldiers died in the snow that day. The survivors who'd crossed the Alps fought with a ferocity that shocked the Romans, who'd expected to face a broken, exhausted enemy. Rome's response combined panic with determination. The Senate raised 4 new legions immediately, pulling men from throughout Italy, drafting citizens who'd never expected to serve. The city fortified its walls for the first time in generations. Politicians who'd been arguing about provincial appointments suddenly unified around survival. The impossible had happened. An enemy army stood in Italy, and Roman military might had failed to stop it. Lake Trasimene followed in June. Hannibal trapped an entire Roman army in a narrow valley beside the lake, then attacked from the hills in heavy fog. The Romans never formed proper battle lines. They fought as confused mobs while Carthaginian forces, positioned perfectly through reconnaissance and patience, slaughtered them systematically. Consul Gaius Flaminius died with his men, 15,000 Romans killed in 3 hours. The lake turned red, bodies washed up on shores for weeks afterward. Then came Cannae, August 216 BC, the southern Italian plains the hottest day of the year, Hannibal commanded 50,000 men facing 80,000 Romans, the largest army Rome had ever assembled. The Romans expected to win through sheer numerical superiority, crushing the Carthaginians through weight of infantry. Instead, Hannibal orchestrated the most perfect tactical victory in military history. His centre deliberately weakened and bent backward, drawing the Romans into a pocket. His cavalry destroyed the Roman horsemen, then circled behind the Roman infantry. His African veterans on the wings compressed inward. The pocket closed. 80,000 Romans became a trapped mass with nowhere to retreat. Carthaginian soldiers killed with industrial efficiency, stabbing into the compressed formation from all sides. Romans couldn't swing swords. They were packed too tightly. They couldn't form lines. There was no room. They couldn't flee. They were surrounded completely. The killing continued for hours. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died, including both consuls, numerous senators, and most of Rome's military-age male population. Cannae represented Rome's worst military defeat ever, worse than anything before or after in the Republic's history. The Alpine crossing had made Cannae possible. Without the shock of Hannibal appearing in Italy from an impossible direction, Rome wouldn't have been desperate enough to field such an enormous army. Without the veteran corps of soldiers who'd survived the mountains, Hannibal couldn't have executed such complex battlefield maneuvers. Without the psychological impact of the crossing, the demonstration that this commander could achieve the impossible, allied Italian cities wouldn't have defected to Carthage after Cannae, which they did in droves. The crossing's immediate psychological impact exceeded its military significance. Romans had considered the Alps an absolute barrier, a natural wall that protected Italy as surely as ocean protected Britain. Hannibal's appearance shattered fundamental assumptions about security and geographic determinism. If the Alps couldn't stop enemies, nothing could. The Senate realized they'd built their entire northern defense strategy around a false premise, which forced complete recalculation of Italy's vulnerability. Historical debate about which pass Hannibal used began almost immediately and continues today, 2,200 years later. Ancient sources, Polybius and Livy primarily, provide conflicting details about the route's specifics. Polybius interviewed survivors and visited the Alps personally, but even he couldn't definitively identify the exact pass. Modern scholars have proposed at least 10 different routes, each supported by archaeological evidence, geographic analysis, or textual interpretation. The leading candidates include the Col de Clapier, Col du Mont-Cenis, Col de Montgenèvre, and the Traversette Pass. Each proposed route has strengths and weaknesses when compared to ancient descriptions. The Col de Clapier matches Polybius's timeline and distance calculations, but requires a difficult high-altitude crossing. The Mont-Cenis route is more accessible, but doesn't perfectly align with descriptions of the terrain. The Montgenèvre Pass is the easiest, but seems too straightforward given the casualties Hannibal suffered. The Traversette matches descriptions of the final descent, but sits extremely high, and would have been more deadly than sources suggest. Archaeological expeditions have searched for evidence, weapons, coins, equipment, animal remains, anything that would definitively prove the route. They found tantalizing clues but no conclusive proof. The elephants that survived the Alps became legendary immediately. Roman soldiers who'd never seen such creatures spread exaggerated descriptions throughout Italy. Animals as large as houses, skin-like armour, strength that could crush 10 men at once, intelligence that approached human reasoning. The psychological impact of war elephants on troops who'd never faced them exceeded their tactical effectiveness. Roman infantry formations broke simply from seeing elephants charge, before the animals even made contact. Most elephants died during that first Italian winter. The climate, while warmer than the Alps, was still far colder than their native North Africa. Several died from infections that started in their frost-damaged feet during the mountain crossing. Others succumbed to respiratory illnesses contracted in the mountains and never properly treated. By spring 217 BC, only a handful remained alive. Hannibal's personal elephant, Surus, described as having one broken tusk and exceptional intelligence, survived until after Trebia, then died from illness. His death was mourned throughout the army. The strategic outcome of the crossing failed to achieve Hannibal's ultimate objective, despite the tactical brilliance that followed. He'd expected Italian allies to abandon Rome en masse after seeing Carthaginian military superiority. Some did defect, particularly in the south after Cannae, but most remained loyal to Rome despite repeated defeats. The Latin communities that formed Rome's core support stayed faithful through the crisis. Without these defections undermining Rome's manpower and economy, Hannibal couldn't force political surrender no matter how many battles he won. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy, winning virtually every engagement, raiding constantly, maintaining an army in hostile territory through sheer tactical genius. He couldn't take Rome itself. Siege warfare wasn't Carthaginian military strength, and Rome's walls were formidable. He couldn't force Rome to negotiate. The Senate absolutely refused to discuss peace, while Carthaginian armies remained on Italian soil. He gradually became trapped by his own success, controlling enough territory to survive but not enough to win, defeating armies but unable to defeat the state that raised those armies. Carthage's failure to support him adequately sealed his eventual defeat. The government in Carthage, controlled by political factions opposed to the Barca family, sent minimal reinforcements and supplies. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal attempted to cross the Alps with a relief army in 207 BC, succeeding in the crossing but getting destroyed by Romans before joining Hannibal. Without reinforcements, without siege equipment, without the full backing of his home government, Hannibal's strategic options steadily narrowed. Rome adapted and survived through institutional resilience that Hannibal hadn't fully anticipated. After Cannae, they refused to fight him in open battle, instead adopting Fabian strategy: harassment, scorched earth, cutting supply lines, besieging Carthaginian allied cities, wearing him down through attrition. The strategy was unpopular, considered cowardly by traditional Roman military culture, but it worked. Hannibal couldn't force engagement against an enemy that refused to engage. The recall to Africa in 203 BC ended Hannibal's Italian campaign. Carthage faced invasion by Scipio Africanus, son of the Scipio who'd missed Hannibal at the Rhone, and needed its greatest general for home defence. Hannibal departed Italy undefeated in the field but strategically unsuccessful, leaving behind devastated regions and tens of thousands of dead Romans, but no conquered capital, no political surrender, no destroyed republic. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC crushed Hannibal's final army and ended the Second Punic War. Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics extensively, understood how to counter them, and employed them against their creator. The defeat was comprehensive. Carthage sued for peace on humiliating terms, massive indemnity payments, territorial concessions, fleet destruction, and prohibition on waging war without Roman permission. Hannibal survived the battle but lost the war, his decades of campaigning ultimately achieving nothing but Roman determination to destroy Carthage completely. The crossing's historical reputation transformed over subsequent centuries. Roman historians initially portrayed it as barbaric rashness that coincidentally succeeded through luck. Later Roman writers, particularly after Carthage's final destruction in 146 BC, began treating it with grudging respect as an example of brilliant but ultimately futile opposition to Roman inevitability. Medieval scholars emphasized the crossing as proof of exceptional military leadership, overcoming impossible obstacles through divine favor or diabolical assistance, depending on the writer's theology. Renaissance military theorists studied the crossing as an example of bold strategic thinking that challenged conventional wisdom. Machiavelli cited Hannibal in The Prince as exemplifying the commander who achieves great things through audacity and force of will. Napoleonic-era historians drew parallels between Hannibal's crossing and Napoleon's own Alpine campaigns, though Napoleon crossed in summer through established passes with vastly better logistics and fewer casualties. Modern military academies teach the Alpine crossing as a case study in several distinct lessons. First, that bold strategic moves can succeed when they force enemies to fight on unexpected fronts. Second, that logistical preparation and reconnaissance enable operations that seem impossible. Third, that leadership quality matters enormously in extreme conditions where discipline and morale determine survival. Fourth, that tactical brilliance cannot compensate for strategic failure. Hannibal won battles but lost the war because military success alone doesn't achieve political objectives. Archaeological evidence continues emerging, adding details to our understanding while raising new questions. Genetic analysis of Carthaginian remains in Spanish excavations reveals recruiting patterns and ethnic composition of armies. Environmental core samples from alpine lakes show climate conditions during specific years. Metallurgical studies of weapons found in mountain passes date them to appropriate periods and origins. Each discovery refines the picture without fully answering the fundamental mysteries. The crossing lives in cultural memory as shorthand for attempting the impossible through preparation and willpower. Modern references to Hannibal crossing the Alps evoke meanings beyond a literal historical event. They suggest bold plans that conventional thinking declares unfeasible, that require extraordinary leadership and sacrifice, that succeed against overwhelming odds but might not achieve ultimate objectives. The phrase has entered multiple languages as an idiom meaning roughly the same thing. Crazy, ambitious schemes that somehow work. The human cost, often forgotten in celebratory retellings, deserves emphasis. Over 30,000 men died in 15 days of mountain crossing. More than American combat deaths in the Revolutionary War. More than British casualties on the first day of the Somme, comparable to atomic bomb deaths at Nagasaki. These weren't anonymous statistics, but individuals with names, families, dreams, and reasons for being there. They died from cold, falls, starvation, disease, and violence, often slowly and painfully. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars forever. The elephant's suffering rarely appears in military histories focused on human achievement. 37 animals, intelligent and emotionally complex, were forced into environments utterly unsuited to their biology. They suffered terror, pain, starvation, and cold they couldn't understand or contextualize. Most died. The survivors were used as weapons until they too died. Their handlers, who'd spent lifetimes with these animals, watched them suffer and could do little to help. This dimension of the crossing's cost exists in no ancient source, but deserves acknowledgement in modern retellings. Hannibal's ultimate fate adds bitter irony to his greatest achievement. After Zama's defeat, he entered Carthaginian politics, but was eventually exiled through opposition intrigue. He fled to eastern kingdoms, serving as military advisor to Rome's enemies, always pursued by Roman diplomatic pressure. In 183 BC, trapped in Bithynia with Romans demanding his extradition, he committed suicide by poison rather than face capture. The man who terrified Rome for 2 decades died a fugitive, hunted to the end, his crossing's glory overshadowed by the war's failure. The Alps themselves remained deadly to military forces long after Hannibal. Napoleon lost thousands crossing in 1800, despite better equipment, established passes, and summer timing. German Wehrmacht units attempting to operate in Alpine regions during World War II suffered severe casualties from weather and terrain. Even today, with modern technology, proper clothing, accurate maps, and helicopter evacuation capability, the Alps kill climbers, hikers, and tourists regularly. Hannibal's success remains exceptional because the difficulty that killed his soldiers hasn't diminished. Only our memory of just how hard it was has faded. The crossing stands as history's most dramatic example of strategic audacity achieving tactical success while failing strategic objectives. Hannibal proved that bold, carefully planned operations could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. He demonstrated that leadership and preparation enable extraordinary human achievement. He showed that believing something is impossible doesn't make it so. But he also proved that tactical brilliance alone doesn't win wars, that military success requires political context, that individual genius cannot overcome systemic disadvantages forever. The final lesson might be the simplest. Some things that seem impossible are merely extremely difficult, and extremely difficult things become achievable through planning, leadership, sacrifice, and luck in proper combination. Hannibal crossed the Alps because he planned for years, led brilliantly, sacrificed brutally, and got lucky enough. The impossible became merely legendary.